It began with rain, slow, soaking, and without urgency. The kind of rain that crept into window frames and softened old wood, that made the village of St. Mary Mead feel more like a memory than a place. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, teacup warm in her hands, watching the world outside dissolve into gray. She had not expected the telephone to ring that early, nor had she expected the voice on the other end to tremble like it did. Miss Marple. It was Gilda Penrose. I know it sounds odd, but I saw light last night. In the attic. I haven't kept candles there since Rupert died. There was a silence before Miss Marple spoke. You're sure it was a candle? I saw it flicker, Gilda whispered. It wasn't electric, and no one has keys. Not anymore. By the time Miss Marple arrived, shawl wrapped tightly and shoes chosen not for style but for steadiness, the clouds had only just begun to lift. The Penrose house stood tall but tired, its ivy-streaked stone walls slouched beneath the weight of years. The garden was overgrown. The air held the scent of damp roses and something older, like forgotten paper, or secrets just beginning to wake. Gilda waited at the gate, her face pale beneath her dark coat. She had aged quickly in the past 2 years, not from illness, but from loneliness, the kind that crept in at night and never truly left with morning. I know it seems small, she said, leading Miss Marple through the quiet hallways, but something's not right. They reached the attic door. It hadn't been opened since Rupert's funeral. Gilda stood back, hands trembling slightly. The key used to be in the linen cupboard, behind the third panel. Miss Marple checked. The panel was loose, but the key was gone. She pressed her fingers to the attic door's edge. The wood smelled faintly of candle smoke. Someone's been here, she said softly, and they weren't looking for dust. The attic door gave way with the sound of time releasing its breath. No grand creak, no dramatic crack, just a sigh, dry and resigned. The room beyond smelled of wax and wilted lavender. Dust hung in the air like memory unsettled. There were boxes, stacked neatly, untouched. An old chaise beneath a yellowed sheet. And on the floor, in the center of a patch where the dust had been disturbed, stood a candle stub, its base sunken into a pool of cooled wax. There was no wind, and yet the room felt emptied. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her eyes not just seeing, but reading. She touched nothing, only noted. The air had been broken recently. Someone had stood here. Someone who remembered how this house once felt when it was full, of music, of voices, of something warm. Did Rupert ever come up here in his final years? She asked softly. Gilda shook her head. Never. Not since the summer of '49. She hesitated. There was an argument. After that, he locked the attic and never spoke of it again. Miss Marple glanced around once more. Then she saw it, just behind the old trunk. A scuff mark. Fresh. From a shoe, perhaps, but wider than Rupert's had ever been. And near it, a faint heel print, almost deliberate, almost left behind like a whisper. The next day, word reached the village that a man had been seen walking the northern path, just past dusk. He wore a dark coat and no hat, and when the constable tried to stop him for being on the wrong side of the church gate after hours, he simply looked once, then kept walking. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't answered, and no one had seen him before. Miss Marple, hearing this from the constable's apprentice while buying scones at the bakery, said only this: not all strangers come to be noticed. Some return only to leave something behind. That night, back at her cottage, she examined the candle stub again. Its scent, faint but there. Rose oil. Not Gilda's, not Rupert's, but someone had once worn it like a signature. The morning after the attic had spoken in silence, Gilda found herself standing at the bottom of her staircase, barefoot, holding something she couldn't remember retrieving. It was a photograph, no frame, no date, only a thick border of ivory-toned paper and the peculiar weight of moments never meant to be shared. Miss Marple arrived before tea had steeped. She had a talent, not just for arriving at the right time, but for knowing precisely when not to ask a question aloud. Gilda held the photograph out to her without a word. Miss Marple took it gently, as one might lift a page torn from a diary never meant to be found. It was an old photo, faded but clear enough to betray its truth. A younger Rupert, standing beside a man neither Gilda nor the village had ever named. The backdrop was unmistakable, the stone bench in the orchard behind the Penrose house. But the detail that mattered most was Rupert's expression, not posed, not forced. It was a smile that didn't come easily in most of his photographs. Here it had. Miss Marple's finger moved slowly to the other man. Tall, coat unbuttoned, hand resting lightly on Rupert's shoulder. She stared at the man's face, and something stirred in the attic of her own memory, something from years past, nearly buried. A name whispered during a christening, a music recital attended by someone who did not belong. This was taken in the spring of 1928, she murmured. Gilda's voice cracked. How could you possibly know that? Because of the roses, Miss Marple said gently. That bush behind them, it only bloomed once and never again. Later that day, while the sky hovered in that strange in-between light before a storm, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the Historical Society archive in Much Bramble. The records were thin, too thin for a family as rooted as the Penroses. But she found the edge of something. A ledger note, a newspaper clipping, a photograph, faded but familiar. Hugh Darrington, a teacher, a pianist, gone missing in 1928. No body, no resolution, but now, unexpectedly, a reappearance. In a photo that should not have survived, in a house that should not remember, and in a smile Rupert Penrose had never worn for anyone else. Miss Marple returned home at dusk. She sat in her drawing room, the photograph on her lap, and thought of all the ways love had learned to hide itself. Sometimes in attics, sometimes in silence, and sometimes against the world's rules, in a photograph that remembered when people were most alive. She placed a photo inside her ledger of unsolved things. And then she waited, because some truths do not shout. They whisper. It was Gilda who found it. Or rather, she claimed she was simply dusting the drawing room when the edge of something rough caught her cloth. The blue vase had stood on that mantel since her wedding day. A gift from Rupert's great-aunt, who had imported it from Vienna and spoken of it more often than she ever spoke of affection. It had held only artificial daffodils since 1940. No one ever moved it, which is perhaps why, when she lifted the vase for the first time in decades, the folded paper beneath it seemed not discovered, but uncovered. She held the letter in trembling hands. The envelope was brittle with age, its flap sealed but unglued. No stamp, no address, just a monogram on the front. G.P. Her own initials, in Rupert's formal hand. She did not open it herself. Miss Marple arrived by 4:30. The fire had been lit, though the weather was not yet cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room had already begun to stretch with that slow, creeping certainty found only in houses where the truth is starting to rise. The letter inside was dated 1929. The ink had faded to the color of old bruises. The handwriting was Rupert's, though the lines trembled with a hesitation she had never known in him. To be opened only if the past insists. It began. He spoke, in language careful but aching, of Hugh Darrington. Not by name, never by name. He called him my shadow, my mirror, the echo I was told to silence. We were young, and the world unforgiving. I was made to choose between inheritance and honesty, between a future on paper and a truth no one would print. He left, not in anger, but in fear. For me. I never saw him again. Only once, in a letter I never replied to. I have kept this room upstairs in case he ever came back. A foolish hope, perhaps, but it made me feel less cowardly. And then, near the end, a line that struck Gilda so sharply she could not finish reading it herself. You were my peace, Gilda, but he was my truth. The silence that followed in the room was not awkward. It was reverent, like a service held for someone never buried. Miss Marple, with a gentleness that came not from pity, but from understanding, folded the letter again and placed it upon the table between them. Gilda stared at the blue vase. I suspected, she said at last, but I didn't ask. I thought perhaps I'd dreamed the way he used to watch the attic window at night. I told myself I was imagining the music, that strange tune he never played in public. Miss Marple did not reply. Some admissions did not require witnesses, only space. Later, when Gilda went to fetch more tea, Miss Marple lingered alone with the fire. The letter still sat there, unguarded, but she did not read it again. She had learned what she needed to know. A man had loved and lost and built his life upon a compromise. A woman had lived beside that man, half blinded not by lies, but by the silence that lies invite. And in a blue vase filled with false flowers, the truth had waited, not to bloom, but to be noticed. It was Mrs. Weatherby, retired teacher, amateur birdwatcher, and unintentional chronicler of the village's quieter oddities, who first spoke of the man. She had been unable to sleep, as often happened during full moons, and had taken her opera glasses to the window in hope of catching sight of the barn owl that sometimes settled near the churchyard yew. But what she saw instead, just past midnight, was a figure walking barefoot across the Penrose garden path. No coat, no hat, no sound but the hush of his steps on the flagstones. He didn't belong to the street, she told Miss Marple the next morning over seed cake and tea. Didn't move like anyone I've seen. He was careful, not sneaky, as though he knew the house, and it no longer knew him. Miss Marple asked if she had seen his face. Mrs. Weatherby shook her head. He kept to the shadows, but he moved like someone who had come not to take, but to remember. The ground was still wet from the recent rains, and Miss Marple, with quiet precision, walked the outer edge of the Penrose garden that afternoon. Most of the path was clean, but just beside the rose trellis, a single footprint remained, bare, clear, and small for a man. She knelt gently beside it, her fingers brushing its edges. Whoever had come had not lingered. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple opened the piano bench. The sheet music was untouched, but tucked beneath it was the photograph she had seen once before. Rupert and Hugh, side by side at the coast, sea wind in their hair, matching jackets not yet softened by time. And now, a date had been written on the back, in ink that had not yet dried, 1927. She did not show this to Gilda. Not yet. That night, she sat by her window longer than usual. The attic light remained dark. The roses did not sway. But something had changed. Not a haunting. Not quite. More like the air had shifted. Like grief had walked through, barefoot and quiet, and left a part of itself behind. She did not speak of the footprint to anyone else. But in the morning, she found the locket again. It had been placed on the back steps. Cleaned. Open. Inside, a photograph, the same as before, but now, tucked behind it, a pressed violet. Crushed flat, faded pale, but unmistakably recent. The man had come back, Miss Marple thought. Not for revenge. Not even for answers. Only to remember. Only to say goodbye. Rupert Penrose's piano had not been played in over 2 decades. Its keys, once polished ivory, now wore a soft yellow tint, age showing itself quietly, without drama. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalrymple, rarely entered the drawing-room unless dusting. But that morning, just before breakfast, she had paused outside the door. There had been music, a slow, faltering melody, hesitant and sorrowful, like someone remembering how to play, or how to feel. But when she entered, the room was empty. No sheet music lay open. The piano bench was untouched. Only the faint resonance of the final note lingered in the air like the scent of old perfume. Later that day, when Miss Marple arrived, she did not ask for tea. She simply walked to the piano, lifted the lid, and laid her fingers gently on the keys. The sound that emerged was faint, brittle. A few notes from a half-forgotten waltz, one she had heard Rupert play many years ago on a summer evening, long before the war, long before silence became the dominant language of the house. Hugh composed it, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Summer of 1927. I remember. They thought no one heard them practicing in the chapel hall. But music is like love. It echoes, whether invited or not. Gilda Penrose stood near the fireplace, her expression unreadable. I knew of him, she said at last, but Rupert never spoke his name. Miss Marple nodded. Some names are not erased. They are simply folded away. From her handbag, she retrieved the letter, the one found behind the vase, written by Rupert, but never sent. She handed it to Gilda, without comment. The widow unfolded it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page with the deliberate steadiness of someone facing a version of the truth she had suspected, but never been certain of. She did not cry. Instead, she looked up and asked, "Do you think he ever loved me?" "I think he tried," Miss Marple replied softly. "But trying is not the same as choosing." The room fell silent again, but not painfully so. It was the kind of stillness that follows confession, not loud, not cleansing, but necessary. A silence that allowed the weight of all things unsaid to settle where they belonged. Outside, the wind had stilled. The lilies in the back garden stood tall, their pale heads bowed as if in quiet witness. Somewhere behind the house, a bird sang a short, mournful tune. It ended abruptly, and the world resumed its hush. And just before Miss Marple left, she looked once more at the piano. The locket now rested atop it, exactly centered, its clasp slightly open. The photo inside remained unchanged, but beside it now lay a folded page of sheet music, blank except for the title, "For D." The lilies had always grown thickest near the sundial. The rest of the garden had fallen into polite neglect, ivy crawling where it pleased, roses blooming late and uneven. But that one corner remained strangely untouched, as though someone had been tending it silently over the years. Miss Marple stood there just after dawn, her gloves damp with dew, her breath caught in the chilled air of early spring. The sundial bore no inscription, only a smooth metal plate pointing to hours that had long ceased to matter. Yet beneath it, the earth had settled strangely, mounded, but not with recent touch. An old disturbance, disguised by time. She bent down gently and pressed her palm flat to the ground. The soil was dry, firm, but not natural. There had once been a box buried there. Someone had removed it, or never quite meant it to stay hidden. And then she saw it, half hidden beneath the drooping head of a lily, a small, rusted tin. No lock, no markings, only silence. Inside were 2 rings, one gold, engraved faintly with the initials RP. The other, a simple band of pewter, and a single, yellowed photograph. It showed Rupert and Hugh standing side by side at a coastal cliff, wind in their hair, eyes squinting into a sun that seemed too large for the frame. No distance between them, no secrets yet required. Folded beside it was a sheet of paper, neither letter nor will, but something in between. Not addressed, not signed, only written. "I tried," it began, "to be what was needed, to silence what was not allowed. But love does not unlearn itself." Miss Marple held it in her lap for a long time that afternoon, seated in her garden with her shawl drawn close, the kettle forgotten. When she finally rose, she walked not to the Penrose house, but to the vicarage. She asked the Reverend to open the records, not for marriage, but for remembrance. Something official, something real. Later that evening, as the sun bowed low behind the hedgerow, Miss Marple returned to Gilda with the box. She said nothing at first, only laid it carefully on the drawing-room table and waited. Gilda lifted the rings first. Her fingers trembled, not from surprise, but from recognition. She had always suspected her place in Rupert's life was shaped more by structure than devotion. But now she knew she had not been abandoned. She had simply been chosen second. "I suppose," she whispered, "he did the best he could." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "He did what he thought he had to." Outside, the first breeze of evening rustled the curtains. Somewhere in the garden, a bird called once, then fell quiet. That night, a candle was lit in the attic once more, not for summoning, not for haunting, but for remembrance. And the attic window, always too stubborn to latch, opened just slightly in the wind, like a breath finally exhaled after decades of silence. The attic had always been cold, but that evening, it felt less like emptiness and more like memory. Gilda Penrose had lit a candle not out of ritual, but as if by instinct, an old movement remembered from another lifetime. The flame flickered quietly near the window, casting long shadows across trunks never unpacked and books never opened. On the far wall, the dust had cleared in the shape of a frame, where the portrait of Rupert once hung. It had been removed months ago, though Gilda could not recall when or why. Miss Marple returned just after dusk. She did not knock. Some doors, once opened by truth, never fully close again. Gilda welcomed her silently, eyes tired but clearer now, as if grief had finally taken a seat beside her instead of standing in her way. They did not speak at first. There was no need. Instead, Miss Marple gently placed a new item on the mantel, a letter, just received that morning, postmarked from Brighton. The handwriting was unsteady, but unmistakably old. I saw the candle. It read, and I knew he had gone. I left the locket in the window, so someone would remember. I thought perhaps time had softened things. But the house didn't know me, and maybe it never will. Tell her I meant no harm. I only came to remember. H.D. Gilda stared at the note a long time. He was here then, she said finally. Not a question, just a truth given space to breathe. After all these years. Miss Marple nodded. He came not to stir trouble, but to settle something that had been unfinished. Gilda looked around the room. The flickering candle, the half-drawn curtain, the small tin box still resting near the hearth. He was kind, she whispered. Rupert. Quietly so. I think he loved you in the way he knew how, and he loved me in the way he thought he should. Which, Miss Marple said, was not the same, but perhaps not any less real. There was silence again. Not awkward, not heavy, just quiet. The kind that follows when truth has been told, not loudly, but clearly enough to change something forever. Later that night, the candle burned low. Gilda did not extinguish it. She let it die out on its own, as if giving permission to the past to rest. Outside, in the overgrown garden, a bird called twice, then stilled, and in the attic window, the wind nudged the pane once more, rattling it gently like a breath too old to carry on, but too sacred to ignore. Somewhere beyond the village, a man walked alone toward a coast where memories waited like stones along the tide. He had no locket now, no photograph, only silence, carried gently in the pocket of his coat. Miss Marple did not return to her cottage immediately that evening. Instead, she walked with measured steps through the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead, her shawl drawn tighter, not from the chill of the breeze, but from something far older, something she always recognized when truth had finally surfaced. The village was quiet, not in mourning, but in the hush that comes after something sacred has been spoken aloud. The gas lamps flickered softly, their amber glow casting long shadows that fell like fingers reaching toward things half-remembered. At the edge of the cemetery, she paused. St. Edmund's Chapel stood in silhouette, the moss-covered stones at its base catching the last light. The bell tower loomed above her, silent now, but watching, as though it too bore witness to secrets once sealed by soil and silence. Miss Marple leaned gently against the iron gate, letting her fingers rest upon the cold metal. A name etched into the stone beside her caught her eye. Half-faded, half-clung to by lichen, forgotten to most, but not to her. From the far edge of the village, the old station clock struck 10. The sound did not carry so much as it settled, like a note struck and left to resonate in wood and bone and memory. She stood there a moment longer, listening not to the hour but to the silence that followed it. Silence was always more honest. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the Penrose home, not with inquiries or insinuations, but with a parcel in hand, wrapped in soft brown paper and tied with violet ribbon. The ribbon had once belonged to a bouquet found years ago, pressed in a book of poetry in Rupert's study. She remembered the scent of the paper as she wrapped the box, lavender and faint smoke. Gilda answered the door herself, still in muted colors, though the edges of her mourning veil were no longer pinned as tightly as before. She accepted the parcel with a wary expression and ushered Miss Marple into the parlor, where tea was waiting though neither of them seemed eager to pour it. In silence, Gilda opened the parcel. Inside lay a small leather-bound sketchbook. The edges had warped slightly from time, the spine cracked in places, but the pages within were remarkably well preserved. Most were blank, curiously so. Rupert had been known for filling his sketchbooks to the corners with careful ink lines and smudged graphite, but this one held only a few pieces. The final page, however, was not blank. There, drawn in a soft pencil hand, barely finished but unmistakably intimate, was a portrait of two men beneath a wind-swept tree, sitting on a bench that overlooked a cliff edge. One looked toward the horizon, his shoulders square but distant. The other sat turned slightly toward him, gaze fixed on the man beside him, with quiet tenderness. The drawing lacked polish, some of the shoreline faded, the outlines unfinished, but the emotion was whole, undeniable. "He never showed this to me," Gilda whispered, fingers trembling just above the paper. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "He may never have meant to, but he kept it. That tells us something." The room held its breath. Outside, a thrush sang once, then flew away. "I think he was afraid," Gilda murmured, voice so low it nearly fell back into silence. "Not just of scandal, but of hurting me. And yet, he hurt me more by saying nothing." Miss Marple nodded. The absence of words can echo longer than the harshest truth. There was a long pause, filled with the creaking of the house, walls that had heard things, lived things, born things. Gilda turned to her. "Do you think he loved me?" Miss Marple considered her answer with care. "I think he tried. And sometimes, love does not fail out of malice, but because it was built on soil already claimed by another root." Gilda closed the book slowly, her hand resting on its cover like one might close a letter never sent. "He was watching the attic window," she said at last, "every evening, as though expecting someone to return." Miss Marple rose. "He wasn't watching for someone. He was waiting to forgive himself. But he waited too long." Later that day, the village saw Gilda Penrose walking through the marketplace, without her mourning veil. She wore a pale plum shawl, still somber, but no longer shadowed. She paused to speak with the baker, the librarian, even old Mrs. Lavery, who had long suspected something unspoken lingered in the Penrose house. Gilda smiled, not brightly, but with the soft, knowing smile of a woman who had begun, at last, to live alongside the truth rather than beneath it. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage armchair, the sketchbook placed neatly beside her knitting basket. She had poured herself a second cup of tea, even though she rarely drank two. Outside, the breeze stirred the lavender in her garden, and the smell of distant rain hung faintly in the air. She opened her journal and wrote just one sentence. "Some loves are not forgotten because they were never fully lived. They endure not in what was done, but in what was left undone." And then she closed the book, folded her hands in her lap, and let the fire crackle in peace. The days that followed were quieter, though not from lack of memory. In St. Mary Mead, quiet was not a void. It was a form of digestion, a way the village absorbed and buried its revelations, like rain seeping into dry soil. Conversations resumed their familiar rhythms, shop bells rang, hedges were trimmed, and life, with all its ordinary layers, tucked the recent truth beneath its apron strings. But Miss Marple did not forget. She never had. On a Monday morning, she received a letter. It was sealed simply, the paper slightly crinkled at the edges. No return address, just her name in a careful hand. She opened it by the garden window while the kettle sang behind her. "Dear Miss Marple, I left the bench before sunrise. I thought I would sit in grief, but instead I found quiet. Not peace, not yet, but quiet. I think it is because you saw us. Not a scandal or sorrow, but simply as what we were, unfinished. Thank you for bringing light without demand. Some stories aren't rescued. Some are only recognized, and that's enough. I am taking the train to Cornwall. There's a boarding house there near the cliffs. I may stay, or I may not. I carry both their rings now. I think they are lighter together. Yours, H.D." Miss Marple placed the letter between the pages of Middlemarch, a novel about choices and the weight they carry, and poured herself tea into her thinnest china cup. By late afternoon, she visited the chapel, not for worship, but to sit. There was now a modest plaque beneath the window in the east aisle, carved in simple script, "For those who waited." No names, no dates, just the weight of implication. She stood before it a moment longer than necessary, not praying, just acknowledging. Outside, the world had turned fully to spring. The lilies in her garden were open, their white petals trembling in the breeze like thin paper before a flame. The roses, not yet bloomed, promised another cycle. Time moved forward again, not dramatically, but steadily. A pulse rediscovered. In her parlor that evening, Miss Marple lit a single candle. Not because she feared the dark, but because she respected what the light could reveal. She looked over the case notes spread before her, clues, sketches, initials never spoken aloud. There was no murder trial, no grand arrest, only lives realigned, like scattered threads, gently threaded through the needle once more. Truth, she reflected, did not always demand justice. Sometimes it only needed witnessing. A room entered, a silence named, a door, once closed in shame, opened quietly to the wind, and perhaps, in that, there was grace. Miss Marple smiled faintly, lifted her cup, and whispered to no one in particular. They waited, and someone remembered. Then she folded away the case. There would be others, but this one, this thread, had been stitched, and it held.